I know why Pastor Tim gets up here first and then dismisses the kids. It's fighting traffic to get through that. So, I brought my emotional support plant today. Did everybody bring your emotional support plant? Just me. Okay. This is actually called a burning bush. So, spoiler alert, we're going to talk about the burning bush this morning. Have you guys seen the burning bush before? The actual plant? Not an actual, I'm not talking about forest fire. Have you seen the plant? Okay. So there's a picture on the front of this. It does not look like a burning bush at all. It just looks like a random weed you'd find in the ditch in Colorado. This actually gets very, very brilliant in fall. It turns this bright and deep red color. By the way, I don't know how Pastor Tim gave me the logo sermon. I don't know how I got that privilege, but that's pretty awesome. So this is it's called the burning bush. And by the way, you can buy this at any one of the big box stores. We won't mention any of their names, but you know who they are. Little do they know that they have Bible history on the name of a plant in their garden center. So you may want to take one of these after today's sermon and say, I'm going to plant one of these in my backyard as a reminder of what God has taught me today. If not, it'll just be a visual aid for right here, for right now. So a little bit of background real quick, not on me, but on Moses. We've been talking about the story of Moses and his life story. And he was born in Egypt in a time when the Pharaoh was fed up with the Israelites, turned them into slaves, and his life was actually at risk. They were trying to kill him, and then Pharaoh's daughter found him, and he was actually raised basically in Pharaoh's house as royalty. One day he was out, saw some of his fellow Israelis being beaten as a part of their slavery, and it touched his heart to the point where he took justice into his own hands and actually killed the Egyptian, buried the body, thought he got away with it. He didn't. Somebody saw, and he ran for his life. He thought, they're going to come kill me because of this. So he ran to the wilderness. Wilderness. So we need to talk about wilderness for just a minute, because I want this to be your frame of reference as you think through the application of this entire story. So I'm going to divide you into 4 people. You're not going to have to move or do anything embarrassing. My wife's an introvert, and so she doesn't like standing up and even raising hands. So the church I grew up in, if somebody raised their hand, you knew we had a guest. That's how conservative we were. So there's four kinds of people in the world, right? Okay, there's hotel people. That's roughing it. It's just a hotel because you're not in your bed, right? There's hotel people. Then there's RV people, right? You bring your home with you. Then there's tent people. By the way, to tent people, RVing, you're not camping. I grew up a tent person. And then there's under the stars people, okay? The people who just backpack out, sleep under the stars. Doesn't matter if they become some wild animal snack. Evidently, they don't really care about life in general, but just under the stars. I want at least a thin layer of fabric between me and the bear, who, of course, doesn't have claws. So those are the 4 categories. So I'm gonna ask you which one you're in. How many of you are in the hotel group? Hotel group, okay. How many in the RV group? Who are the tent campers? Okay, yeah, did you just see the RV people raise their hands? Thank you. And how many are the under the stars people? Okay, just a few. If you're not an under the stars people, to understand the wilderness, you're going to have to talk to one of those people that just raised their hand. When we think of the wilderness, oftentimes it's used as a figure of speech for a barren time in our lives. But let's talk just for a minute to the under the stars people, okay? What do you do when you go out to the wilderness and bring nothing with you? What do? You survive, right? That's your only goal is just to survive in the wilderness. If you're a hotel person, that's like, think of Motel 6. But they turned off the water and the power, and somebody stole the mattress. I don't know, that's the best I can describe it to the motel people. So you're trying to survive in the wilderness. That's it. And that's what Moses was doing. He was in survival mode. So as you think of the wilderness and Moses calling, don't think of it as, well, it was a barren place. It was. It very much was. Don't think of it as a barren place in your life. It might just be survival mode. Maybe God is calling you out of survival mode, where you're just keeping your head above water, and that's all you can do. So grab your Bibles and turn to Exodus chapter 3. We have some material to cover today. It's a chapter and a half. I promise I'll get you out of here by 2. By the way, if you want to get invited back, end early. That's what they tell me. So Moses is in survival mode. He's out in the wilderness. And we're going to start with Exodus chapter 3. You start right in verse 1. Hey, before we do that, let's go ahead and pray one more time. God, we thank you for the privilege of coming to your word. We thank you for the instruction it gives our lives. We thank you for your interactions with Moses and how they can inspire us, encourage us, and let us know your calling in our lives. God, I pray that we would hear from your word, not from me, God. I am just the mouthpiece. God, may we hear from your word, and may your Holy Spirit speak to our hearts. In Jesus' name we ask, amen. So Exodus chapter 1, we're going to look at the first 3 verses, and we're going to see where God reveals himself and reveals his plan, and it shows his heart. So Exodus 3, verses 1 to 3. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. So Moses is shepherding sheep in the wilderness. You realize this is going to come in handy, right? Later, if you know the rest of Moses' life, wilderness survival, and sheep and the children of Israel. Sheep are kind of, I wasn't going to say dumb. We'll just say dumb. Sheep are dumb. They tend to do whatever they want to do and don't sense danger, and they tend to wander off. And Moses was getting called to do a similar thing, except with humans. All we like sheep have gone astray. Why does God call us sheep? It's relatable. That's who we are. We have a tendency to wander. So here's Moses leading sheep, and he goes to the edge of the desert. In the desert there, in the wilderness, they would have what they call wadis, W-A-D-I, wadi. And it's kind of like a valley, and the seasonal streams would flow there, and there'd be a little bit of vegetation down at the bottom of that. So most likely probably headed to one of those to feed his sheep. And this says, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in the bush. Now, notice it says, the angel of the Lord. We'll go on to see this is actually an appearance of God himself, not in his full glory, but it is an appearance of God himself. Theologically, you'd call that a theophany, God appearing to them. So he sees a flame in the middle of this bush, but the bush is not getting burned up. Imagine wilderness tinder. We've seen wildfires east of town, like grass fires, and you know how fast it just tears through the grass. Imagine that. And he sees something that's on fire, and something small and scraggly and in the wilderness would be consumed very, very quickly. And so it stood out to him. I was kind of amused. Have you seen the series The Chosen? I was imagining them dramatizing this, and Moses very nonchalantly sees a bush on fire, and he's just like, I'm going to go take a look. It's just the way he says it is very just kind of nonchalant. But you notice he says, I'm going to take a look at this great sight. So he noticed this was something out of the ordinary. This wasn't just, the sun was reflecting off a rock just right. He's been in the desert for 40 plus years. He knows when something's interesting and when something's actually on fire and not being burned up. So I'm going to turn around and take a look at this. A normal fire definitely would not have piqued his interest. He would have just steered his flock away from them. So look at verse 4. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you're standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was just afraid to look at God. So he called Moses by name. If you hear voices in the wilderness, you have other questions, right? You're like, I haven't drank enough water today. But he called Moses by name, and Moses very quickly realized that this was something beyond just some anomaly in the desert. He was warned of God's holiness. He says, don't come near here. Take your shoes off. Respect. You're on holy ground. So this was an appearance of God himself, not just an angel. Moses immediately reacts with faith and with reverence. He was still very much a man of faith. Even having been separated from the family of God for all these years, he still very much believed in the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. And he didn't even question that this was God. He wasn't like, are you sure that's you, God? Or am I just hearing things? Like he knew right away. So this was a very distinct experience, stood out to him as God revealed himself to him. And then God shows his heart. Look at verses 7 to 9. This is what was on God's heart. In verse 7, then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. When I was a kid, I don't know, little kid, we'd say that list, we'd be like, and the Jebusites, and the mosquito bites. Did anybody else see that? Okay, that was just me, okay. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. So God says his plans for deliverance. And I want to encourage you with this, as sometimes you might feel like you're suffering, you're being oppressed, life is holding you down, you have struggles, and you feel like nobody sees. This had been going on for years. And now what does it say? God said, I see that. I know. I'm hearing their cries. He sees, he hears, and he knows. So even when you're in the midst of hard times, persecution, or just struggles of life, know that even when you don't feel God there, God is here. He sees, he hears, and he knows. And this is on his heart. Your suffering is on God's heart, even if it seems like no one's listening. So God said he was going to bring them out of slavery, but it wasn't just we're going to deliver them from slavery. It was, I'm going to take them out of slavery and actually bring them from a place of complete persecution to a place of complete abundance. It sounds like a very sticky land, flowing with milk and honey. Pretty sure it's a figure of speech, but a very abundant land. So from the place of destitution and poverty and nothing you have is your own, everything you make, you give to someone else. You're going to go from that to where you can now reap the rewards of your labor. A promise that was just way beyond just, hey, can we just not be slaves anymore? A promise to actually take them out of that. And you can see God's heart here for his people. He doesn't want to just deliver them. He actually wants to bring them to a place of abundance. So if you're in that place today, or if you're in that phase of life, or if you're looking back on that phase of life, look for God's hand and know that God hears you, know that God sees you, and he's going to reveal himself. It may not be in your timing, it often isn't, but God's going to reveal himself. So here's his plan. Look at verse 10. He says to Moses, he says, come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? God said, but I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you, that when I have sent you, this will be a sign that I have sent you, that when you've brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So God now is talking to Moses, shows him his plan. I'm going to use you. He invites Moses into his plan, and God's going to show his authority here for this plan. So Moses is commissioned. This is God's plan, but Moses gets to be a part of it. And Moses feels inadequate. And think about where Moses is at in life. He used to live with royalty. He used to live with Pharaoh, and now he's in survival mode in the desert, had run for his life, is leading sheep, not people. If you were to look at Numbers 12, verse 3, and you don't have to turn there, but Numbers 12:3 says that Moses was a most humble person. Actually, it says Moses was the most humble person. So Moses, throughout his life, has been a humble person, but his humility might take him down a path of insecurity to the extreme. And notice that he doesn't disagree with God's plan. He doesn't say, oh, that's not a good plan. They're doing all right there. They're making bricks, I hear. That's good. They're just leaving them there. No, this was on Moses' heart too. That's why he was in the wilderness in the first place. He so wanted the fellow Israelites to be delivered that he had actually taken justice into his own hands. So this was on Moses' heart too. God was calling him to something that was already on his heart. He had even delivered, remember when he went to the desert, he had delivered Jethro's daughters. They were trying to water the sheep, and he stepped in there. So he was being who God had called him to be, even in this survival mode. He was still looking to follow God's plan, even out in the desert. So Moses said, who am I? I'm not the guy. I'm not I have no authority. I'm not a leader there anymore. I'm leading sheep here. If he'd still been in Pharaoh's house, it might have been like, yeah, no, that makes sense. I'm in a position of authority. But he wasn't there. And what does God say? God does not say, yes, you are. God says, I will be with you. It's not Moses' authority that's at stake here, or that's at question. It's God's authority. It's God's plan. And so he doesn't say, yeah, you're right, never mind, I'll go with somebody else. And he doesn't say, no, you do have the authority. He says, you're there on my authority. It's God's authority. And then God gives him a promise. He says, when you bring the people back, you're going to serve me on this mountain. So think about your life. Have there been times when God led you through something and you got to a point and you looked back and said, yeah, God did that. I didn't do that. This is what God's promising. You're going to get the children of Israel out. You're going to come back here and you're going to remember this. So think back in your life as a way to embolden your own faith. Are there points? Are there milestones? Are there events in your life that God has brought you to? And you need to remember those to move forward with God's plan. So he answers the question of authority. It's not Moses, it's God's authority. And then he's going to explain who he is and why he has that authority. Look at chapter 3, verse 13. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me, and they ask me, what's his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this I will be remembered throughout all generations. So Moses, well, it says, how do I prove this? How do I prove that I'm actually, what's your name? How do I even tell him I'm coming on behalf of God? God who? And if you think of the environment of Egypt and the doubt that could have been sown while Moses was in Pharaoh's house, he might be serving some of the Egyptian gods, and they had many. So he goes out in the desert. We don't know what he did for the last 40 years and comes back. Maybe he found some crazy religion in the desert. We hear he was at the Mount of God. Maybe he found something else there. How do I say, no, this is our God? And so God gives him his name, Yahweh. If you have the King James Version of the Bible, and there's several others that do it too, when it uses the word Yahweh, it'll do a capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, but the next three letters will be lowercase. And the name Yahweh for God is actually used, when I wrote it down, 6,823 times in the Old Testament. 6,800 times. So this is a very, very, one of God's favorite things to call himself. And it is, I am. I am the self-existent one. No one created God. He does not need anything from us to exist, to sustain. I am who I am. God also identifies with their forefathers. Yes, I am the God of Israel, God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. But from now on, call me Yahweh. I am the self-existent one. So God's plan was based on his authority, the self-existent one. He didn't need any human input for his plan. God knows all. He's all-powerful. And he doesn't need anything from them, hence the name I am. So God then promises him, you'll serve me back on this mountain when you come back through. And I was thinking, if you were in Moses' place, you're like, that doesn't really help me today. You're telling me after I go where I might get murdered, then I'll come back here. Can I get something for today? I wouldn't think that'd be very reassuring. But hopefully Moses came back later and remembered that and had that milestone for him. So God may be calling you out of mediocrity, out of survival mode, like he was calling Moses. By the way, you know how old Moses was when this happened? You want to take a guess? You want to take a guess at Moses' age? Yeah, he was 80 years old. And you think, well, God's been taking a long time to give me life's calling. Not too many octogenarians in here. God may still be working you. He still may be honing your skills. And he may have you doing what he wants you to do where you're at now. But God also may be calling you out of survival mode. So in verses 16 to 22, I'm actually going to summarize 16 through 22 because it talks about God's plan in detail for getting the children of Israel out. In a couple of weeks, Pastor Tim's going to actually cover that. So basically he says, I'm going to send you, Moses, there. You're going to talk to the elders. You're going to tell them the plan. You and the elders are going to go to Pharaoh. I'm going to deliver you with such a great deliverance that not only are they going to let you leave, they're going to want you to leave, and they're going to give you gifts. And so that's 16 through 22. And like I said, Pastor Tim's going to cover. That's, what's funny is, I'm like, this is repetitive because he does this later. Well, that's because God said, here's what I'm going to do. And then he did it. So of course it's repetitive because he does what he says he's going to do. So that's okay. We're going to move all the way over to chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse 1. So God gives him his authority, and he says, here's the plan. He gives him his authority, invites him into that plan, and then God's going to strengthen Moses' boldness now. He's going to strengthen his boldness and show his power. 4 verse 1, Moses answered, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. Notice Moses doesn't doubt the message. He doesn't doubt God's authority. He doubts his ability to successfully deliver that message, and that they would actually believe that he was there on behalf of God. And think about it. Think of his history. Would the children of Israel have any reason to doubt his authority? Remember what happened in, Exodus 2:14. He killed the Egyptian who was beating the Israeli, and the next day he found 2 Israelis fighting. He said, hey, guys, stop fighting. And they said, what, are you going to kill us too? Who made you judge over us? That was his parting interaction with the children of Israel. And now 40 years later, he's going to come back. Sure, he had reason to doubt that they would accept that he was coming back, stepping into this role as a representative of God. He had defied Pharaoh, so he could be doubted in his motives. So think about this in your life. Have you had a time or place where you've failed in something that God has called you to do? Have you had a time where you've stepped up to the plate and then you've failed? You know what's hard? Stepping back into that after failure. It's almost harder than doing it the first time. I would say it's harder than doing it the first time. You're trying to be a spiritual leader in your home and you fail at it. Maybe you've accidentally taken a break for 5 years. And then next week you're like, family, okay, we're going to get together and get back into God's word. And they're like, who are you? What'd you do with our dad? Stepping back into that can be even harder than doing it the first time. And this is what Moses was doing. He had failed. He had taken justice into his own hands and had failed. And now he was going to step back into that. So 2 things. Number 1, know that if you need to step back into something God has called you to do, yes, it's going to be hard. But if it's what God's called you to do, it's on his authority, not based on your track record. And then also, if you're at a crossroads now, trying to decide, am I going to follow God the first time, keep in mind what I just said about the second time. If you ignore his calling the first time, if you fail the first time, the second time is harder. So if you think delaying will make it easier, it doesn't. So just want to encourage you with Moses stepping back into something like this when he very much had failed the first time. So chapter 4, verse 2. Moses says, hey, they're not going to listen to me. Chapter 4, verse 2. The Lord said to him, what is in your hand? And he said, a staff. And he said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand, catch it by the tail. So he put out his hand, caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. And God said, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of our fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. So Moses has his staff. I didn't bring a staff in with me, but think of a shepherd's crook. So he's shepherding sheep. So he has his staff. He can use it to ward off danger. He can use it to help sheep out of tight spots, which they like to get into. Have you seen the video on YouTube where there's a sheep stuck in this ditch, and this guy helps the sheep get out of the ditch, and the sheep goes running off and then makes a turn and jumps right back into the ditch again? Yeah, that's what he was dealing with. And so he has this staff with him to help him out of those situations. And so God says, he's having this, picture this for a minute, okay? He's having this intense conversation with God from a bush that's on fire. And then he takes his staff and God says, throw it on the ground. I'm going to show you something awesome. And he throws it down and it turns into a snake. And you see what it says Moses did? What his reaction was? He ran. Again, I would love to see whoever does The Chosen, just the video on this of him high-stepping it out of there after this super intense conversation with God. That also means that there was a very real snake. Moses was in the desert. He knew what snakes looked like. He knew what a snake was, and he ran away. But then God said, okay, I need you to face your fears. By the way, my wife is terrified of snakes. I will never play a snake-related prank on my wife. I've been married 26 years, and I'd like to keep it that way. So Moses saw the snake and ran away. And God said, okay, I want you to face your fear. I want you to go grab that snake by the tail, and it miraculously turned back into his staff again. And think about this. This staff was for his protection, and God turned it into something dangerous, and then back into something protective again. God was in charge of his safety. It was God who was going to deliver them from danger, not him. But it was in Moses' hand. God was empowering him to do it. Sorry, I'm really dry today. So here's the sad thing, and we're going to see in a minute that Moses asked for help and had Aaron come help him. So in Exodus 7, verse 10, Aaron actually got to do this miracle in front of Pharaoh instead of Moses, which is a bummer because Moses had this thing that God had given him, this sign, and he didn't actually get to perform it for Pharaoh. So God shows his power this way, and then God gives him a second one in verse 6, chapter 4, verse 6. Again, the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak. And he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous, like snow. Then God said, put your hand back inside your cloak. So he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. If they will not believe you, God said, or listen to the first sign, they may believe the second sign. I did not do this in the slideshow, but if you want to do a Google image search on leprosy, don't do it when you're sitting to the dinner table. It's horrific. It's a horrific disease that eats away your flesh. Frequently starts with the hands, and you end up losing fingers. And leprosy at this time, basically uncurable, and you're shunned from society. So this was a big deal. And God actually used leprosy a variety of times to actually judge people who were disobedient to him. We saw Moses' sister, Miriam, actually got struck with leprosy as a curse because of her disobedience to God. So, oh, by the way, there's less than 20,000 cases of leprosy in the U.S. per year. Does that seem high to you? Okay, good. Me too. 20,000? Okay. So it's not a common thing, and I think they have a little bit more treatment for it than what they used to, but it used to be you were shunned from society. So God told Moses, put your hand inside your cloak, and he pulled it out, and it was just covered with leprosy. And then he put it back in, brings it out again, and it was completely gone. So if leprosy was often a curse for disobedience, this is almost like God saying, I can heal. Sure, you were disobedient, but God can restore. It was also a miraculous sign that God is in charge of your health, your safety, something that would have gotten you shunned from society, which is one of Moses' fears, was that he was going to be shunned when he came back and tried to step into this leadership role. So this was a sign, and God says, if they don't believe the first one, I mean, if you saw somebody throw a stick on the ground and it turned into a snake, you might be like, did I see that right? Or, it's just a magic trick. God said, I'll give you a second one. And Moses, by the way, didn't even ask for a second one. God just jumped in and gave it to him. So here comes number 3, chapter 4, verse 9. If they will not even believe these two signs or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. So God didn't actually perform this one, but he said, you've got this one for number 3 for your backup. And Moses wasn't at the Nile River. He was out in the middle of the wilderness. So clearly God did not do this there. But God gave this to him. He said, you're going to take some water, you pour it on dry ground, so it's going to be clear and obvious. It wasn't like, I poured it in a puddle, and the puddle was kind of red at the bottom, and it stirred it up, and it was blood. He said, pour it on dry ground, so you know, and it's going to turn to blood. This was a bit of a foreshadowing. Remember the 12 plagues? We're going to study the 12 plagues, not 4 plagues, 12 plagues in a few weeks, when God struck the water supply for the Egyptians. And in Exodus 7:19, guess who got to perform this miracle? Aaron. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Moses missed out on this one too. Through God's power, Moses and Aaron actually did use these signs together to the elders, but then when they went before Pharaoh, Aaron actually got to do these things. So God gives him 3 signs to give him boldness. It wasn't to prove the message. Moses agreed with the message. Moses knew the calling. He acknowledged the calling, but God gave him these 3 signs to actually give him the boldness. It was in answer to him saying, they're not going to believe me. So it wasn't for, I don't even think, if Moses had not said that, I don't think he would have even needed these signs. I believe this was God's calling and God's plan. And if Moses had just said, got it, I'll go do it, I don't think he would have even needed these signs because this was God's plan. But God did this for Moses. He met Moses where he was in doubting whether or not he had the ability, which, by the way, should be reassuring to us. I'm sure you have concerns when God calls you to do something big and you're thinking, I don't know. I don't know if that's God's plan or my plan. I don't know if I have the authority to do it. And God often meets us where he is. So next up, God gives Moses help and shows his mercy. Look at chapter 4, verse 10. Moses said to the Lord, "Oh, my Lord, I'm not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and tongue." And the Lord said to him, "Who's made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what to speak." So Moses doubted the effectiveness of his message, and now he doubts his own ability. He says, I'm not a good speaker. I like the fact that it says, I'm not a good speaker. Not even since we started talking now. Nothing's changed. I'm still not a good speaker since this conversation started. When you think about it, he was probably thinking, well, God just performed 3 miracles. How about he all of a sudden makes me, Shakespeare or something, just so I can. And God's like, I'll show you these miracles. You'll have confidence. And he's like, you're still not a good speaker. That's okay. That's okay. You notice that God doesn't deny this? God doesn't say, oh, no, you're a good speaker. All he promises is to be with him. So sometimes we're waiting on God's calling, like, God, I need this thing, this skill, this ability, this house, this whatever, this job. I need this relationship, this boldness. And God says, you don't have it, but I'm going to be with you. That's when we get an opportunity to see the power of God, is when it's beyond our ability. If we're just doing what we can already do, you miss the opportunity to see God actually do the work and to give him all of the credit for it. So also, you notice something that Moses says, hey, I'm not a good speaker. He's not surprising God. God didn't come to him and say, I want you to lead the children of Israel. And he's like, I'm not a good speaker. And God's like, oh yeah, sorry, I forgot about that. When God gives you a calling, you cannot give him new information. Let me say that again. When God gives you a calling, you cannot give him new information. You can only acknowledge what he already knows. This didn't surprise God. He knew. And he didn't say, I'm going to fix the problem. He says, I'm going to be with you in that problem. So look at verse 13. Moses is running out of reasons here. But he said, oh, my Lord, please send someone else. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth. And I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth. And you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand the staff with which you shall do these signs. So God had handled his objections. God had answered his questions. And he's like, is there anybody else? Please, could you just send somebody else? He got to the point of, well, I asked the questions, God answered those, God's empowered me, he gave me the signs, and he was just like, I still not feeling it. Can you please call somebody else? And this is where God got angry. Notice God didn't get angry with questions. You can ask questions, but there's a difference between questions and a desire to disobey God's calling. And now Moses is at this point where he's at the crossroads, and he's like, I don't want to. Can we get somebody else to do it? And that's when God is angry. And he's still kind of, I think, harping on this, but I'm not the guy for the job. And so God gives him Aaron. Aaron is his brother. By the way, do you know how old Aaron was? He's young and energetic. That's why we're calling him. Aaron is Moses' older brother. He's 83. Yeah. So it's not like, hey, get the young guy with the energy in here. No, here's my even older yet brother. And so God gives him Aaron. And he says, but God still keeps Moses in the calling. He says, you're not getting off this scot-free. I'm still want to use you. So I'm going to speak through you to Moses, and then Moses will be your mouthpiece. And so God's going to give his words to Moses. Moses is going to give them to Aaron, and Aaron's going to be the communicator. But God still wants Moses in there. Imagine again if Moses had had the boldness to just say, okay, I'm in. I don't think I can do it, but I'm going to trust you. The things that he could have done directly. And how even more miraculous it would have been, because God would have been using somebody who wasn't a great speaker, who wasn't confident, who was very humble. So Aaron got to be the person that God used to enact some of the plagues that showed God's mighty power. And think of Moses, what he actually missed out on. He could have been there in the first person and experiencing God's power. And in some of these situations, he was secondhand because he had these doubts. You may feel inadequate to God's calling. You may feel like, I don't have it. I don't have what it takes. And God might send you help. But you might miss out on some of the joys and experiences of God's power if you don't jump in yourself. Which, by the way, is not an excuse for going it alone. I'm not saying never get help. We are the family of God. We're called the body of Christ. And we do work together. We do have something to offer each other. But when God has called you to something, and you say, nah, step aside, I'm going to let somebody else handle it, you might actually miss out on the chance to really experience God's power. So I can't tell you God's exact plans for your life. So I'm going to ask you some questions. Instead of giving you statements for application, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to reflect. I'm going to actually let Bill close. I'm not going to do an invitation at the end. And while we're singing I Surrender All, I want you to ask these questions of yourself or anything else God has laid on your heart. At what point will you decide to follow God's calling in your life? At what point? Is it going to take a miraculous sign? Or are you just going to listen to God and do as he says? Are you willing to live a God-focused life where you're at right now, like Moses did in the wilderness, even if you're in survival mode? What risks would you be willing to take for God? Moses risked his life, the respect of his people, his safe place out in the wilderness, and his family. But what do you risk missing out on if you don't follow God's calling? Should you, like Moses, set up a marker where God says, someday you're going to come back here and you're going to realize I did this? Do you have those waypoints in your life? Do you need to review them? And who might be suffering, like the children of Israel? The children of Israel were suffering, waiting for God to deliver them. And you could be a part of someone's deliverance from suffering, but they're waiting for you to step in and follow God's call. I just want to encourage you, let God call you, let God speak to you, and surrender.